Okay, this is a 10-minute intro to Monopoly. I'll probably need to break this into two parts. We'll see how we go. I suspect the first part I'll do kind of some of the background features, and then tomorrow I can come back to some of the advantages and disadvantages. So, in terms of Monopoly, obviously, there's this idea of a pure monopoly is a firm with a 100% market share, but you don't tend to see those very often. Some of the local water companies in the UK, they have 100% monopolies, what people tend to do is they tend to conflate, treat as the same, pure and natural monopolies. They're not the same thing. A natural monopoly, it may or may not have 100% market share. What a natural monopoly is one where it would be efficient. To have only one firm in the market. And that's because of the level of, the very high level of economies of scale. Now, a natural monopoly might not actually be a monopoly, but if it wasn't, then it would be inefficient. And we're talking about things normally with very big networks. So we would apply that classically to things like water, trains, kind of electricity and gas and so on, where you don't really want two sets of infrastructure. It would be a waste. There are economies of scale from having one firm building all the infrastructure. And some people have extended that to things like information monopolies, where there are network effects. In reality, though, because we very rarely have 100% market share, a more common definition is that of a working monopoly. And a working monopoly is where one firm has over 25% of the market. So it has above a 25% market share. So you've got pure monopolies and you've got working monopolies. Working monopolies are the most common ones. And at that stage, of course, what you'll be realising is that there is quite a high extent of overlap between monopoly and oligopoly. And most of the points that we're going to make here about monopoly, in fact, all of the points that we're going to make here about monopoly, can also apply to particularly concentrated oligopolies. So monopoly is what we would describe as a very concentrated market. And concentrated just refers to how much of the market lies in the hands or rests in the hands of one or a small number of firms. So a concentrated market has a high concentration ratio. And the concentration ratio just shows the market share added up of the n largest firms. So in monopoly, if we looked at the one firm concentration ratio, it would just be the share of the biggest firm. But you might say look at the 2 or 3 firm concentration ratio, to show how much power is concentrated in the hands of a small number of firms. So the point about monopolies then, what you want to be asking yourself is, well, how do they get to be a monopoly? How is this happening? And the key is that there are, when we think about the characteristics of oligopoly, the first thing is that there are barriers to entry. Because if there weren't, given that monopolies are likely to be making very high levels of abnormal profits, we've seen in perfect competition and monopolistic competition, that new firms would enter and take the market away from the monopolist. So therefore, there must be barriers to entry. And in theory, we can divide those into what are sometimes called, what are called structural barriers to entry and behavioural barriers to entry. Structural barriers to entry are just things, they're just features of the market that deter entry. And that can be things like setup costs. If you need to invest 300 million quid in a factory, then that's a deterrent to the market. It can be things like economies of scale. So if there are already big firms, that's a deterrent. And it's not anything that anybody's done deliberately. So these are non-deliberate, they're just features. Whereas behavioural, they're barriers, these are deliberate. These are deliberate barriers or restrictions created by existing firms. So that can be things like limit pricing. where you try to set your prices below the cost levels of potential entrants. Kind of advertising to build up market share. And inevitably, some things lie in between. So for example, patents and research and development, is that a deliberate barrier? Well, could be. Or is it just the nature of a market? It could be. So some will have features of both. Because of barriers to entry, what that means is that in a monopoly, they can make abnormal profits in the long run. So again, we can just draw our standard diagram. There's quantity, there's revenue, cost, price, or just pounds there. A monopolist will obviously face a downward sloping demand line. MR, like in all market structures, is twice as steep as AR. Because they're going to make abnormal profits, we'll make AC be below AR. It's crap. We'll get marginal cost to go through the minimum points of the average cost curve, because it always does. We then find the profit maximising output Q star, which is where MC equals MR. And then at that output, we're going to go, well, there's the price, there's the cost, and there's your abnormal profit, your supernormal profit. Okay, so firstly, what we can say is that in the long run, abnormal profits, supernormal profits can be made. And the reason for that is that there are barriers to entry in the long term. There are always barriers to entry in all market structures in the short run because of the fixed factor of production. So in the short run, you can't enter a monopoly, even if you wanted to, or in perfect competition, or monopolistic competition, or oligopoly, because you don't have the relevant fixed factor of production. In the long run, you can enter perfect competition and monopolistic competition. You probably can't. Well, you can't really enter monopoly. Now, we've seen that in reality, some monopolies have been broken into. So, usually by kind of crossover entry. So what's happened is that a firm with large amounts of profit in another sector uses that to batter its way into a monopoly market. Or sometimes you'll get somebody who comes in, does something very clever or different, and then gradually build their market share. So it's not necessarily that barriers to entry are absolute. It just makes it's just difficult or expensive to break in. The second point about monopoly that I'm going to do in this video is that they have price setting power. So they have a lot of control over their price. And one of the features, one of the factors, one of the implications of that is that they can engage in what's called price discrimination. And price discrimination means setting different prices to different groups of consumers for what's basically the same product. And we've seen lots of examples of this here. So when I taught this, we talked about blue versus pink price discrimination. Blue razors are much cheaper than pink razors because women are being discriminated against. We looked at peak versus off-peak travel. We looked at men's versus women's haircuts and so on and so forth. Essentially, you've got something that's where so maybe the product is slightly different, but we can't explain the full difference in price as a result of costs. So we can't explain price differences because of cost differences. Differences in production costs. Okay, so how do you do this? In order to price discriminate, there are certain characteristics that have to be present before that's possible. So if we look at the requirements, firstly you have to be able to separate your markets. So the market segments have to be separable. Otherwise, everybody's just going to buy in the low price market. Secondly, we've got to have different PEDs in the two markets, or more markets, so in the two segments. And because if the markets are identical, there's no point in price discriminating. So you need somebody with inelastic demand that you can charge a high price to, and somebody with elastic demand that's going to get the lower price. Then it can be useful to have information asymmetry. but that's not essential. But the key ones are the markets have to be separable and there have to be different price elasticities in the two segments. So is price discrimination a good thing or a bad thing? And you might immediately initially think that price discrimination is quite negative because it means that some groups face an increase in price. So therefore there's a decrease in consumer surplus. That basically this is just exploitation, and often you're right. Often that's exactly what's going on here. Yeah? But it's more interesting, I think, to think about reasons that price discrimination might be beneficial. What we can say is that actually, some groups benefit from price discrimination, and normally those groups are the ones with high PD, elastic demand, and they tend to be low-income groups. Now, I'm not saying that the monopoly is being kind to poor people out of the goodness of its heart, but it is nevertheless a positive side effect. We might say that price discrimination is necessary in some cases, for any profits to be made, and that if they weren't allowed to price discriminate, then the market would go away for everybody. So, examples where we've seen this is we've seen that pharmaceuticals tend to sell for very high prices in developed countries, but they're sold at a discount in less economically developed countries. But if they weren't able to charge high prices in developed countries, there would be no profit in making antibiotics and other drugs, and therefore they wouldn't be created at all. So that's a brief overview. There's some notes in the OneNote page, a few questions. There's an essay on the advantages and disadvantages of competition. You might want to look at the essay plan. But I'll come back tomorrow to look at the good and bad features of monopoly overall.